I made thousands of dollars in just 7 days betting on football. But most people just lose all their money, so how did I pull this off? Was it strategy or was it just good luck? Trust me, there were moments where everything almost blew up. Which is why I'm going to show you exactly what I did from day 1 all the way to day 7, with every win, every loss, and the point where it almost went all wrong. So day 1 started with a decision that most gamblers would probably call stupid. So if I was going to test whether sports betting could actually make money, I just didn't want to start with tiny bets. I wanted to know if the research held up when real money was on the line. So for the very first bet of the week, I had to go big. And we went with $1,000 on Everton to beat Burnley. Now, Everton aren't exactly a powerhouse team, so at first look, this may look like a weird place to start. But once I looked closer at the matchup, a few things really stood out to me. Number 1, Burnley were dealing with some serious injury problems. Several of their key players like Tuanzebe and Roberts were out, and when a team loses that many starters and key players, things really do start to break down quickly. The defense obviously gets weaker, the structure obviously disappears, and games just start slipping away from teams. And then number 2, Burnley have always struggled away from home. This kind of pattern isn't usually random. Some teams just don't travel well, and Burnley have one of the worst away sides in the entire league. But not only that, but Everton also had a slight psychological edge. See, in the last 3 league meetings between these teams, Everton hadn't lost once. So once you put all of that together, this bet really did start to make sense. Of course, football is unpredictable, and even the best looking bets fail all the time. But compared to most games on the board, this one felt like a solid place to begin the challenge. And just like that, the first bet of the week landed. Everton got the win, and that means the week started in profit, which is absolutely massive. But instead of protecting the bankroll and slowing down, I decided to do something that was probably very stupid. See, I went looking for an underdog here. The second game was Leeds versus Sunderland, and this time the odds were completely different. Instead of a favourite, I put $250 on Sunderland to win at 4.6 odds. At those odds, the sportsbook is basically saying Sunderland only wins this game 1 in 4 times. So, why did I take the risk? I took the risk because Leeds have a defensive problem that has shown up every week. They're conceded in about 7 straight games, and across the entire season, they have only kept a clean sheet in about 6% of their matches, which is obviously absolutely ridiculous. So in simple terms, Leeds give up a lot of goals. And Sunderland in recent times have been surprisingly comfortable at Elland Road. Over the last 6 visits to Elland Road, Sunderland had only lost once. They also play a very disciplined defensive style, which makes them hard to break down. So when I saw the 4.60 odds, it started to look like less of a crazy gamble and more of a price that could be slightly wrong here. But still, this was the kind of bet that either makes you look really smart or really stupid. There's no in between. Because if Sunderland lost, then nobody would question it. They were the underdog. But if they won, it would completely change the first day of the challenge. And that is exactly what happened. Sunderland managed to pull off the upset. And just like that, day 1 ended with 2 winning bets, and the combination of those wages produced $1,470 in profit in 1 day. So for a challenge that was supposed to last a full week, hitting that kind of number on the very first day felt very surreal. But early success creates a new problem, because the bigger the bankroll gets, the harder it is to stay disciplined with the next bet I'm going to place. And the next day was going to test exactly that. So heading into day 2, the goal wasn't to chase another crazy underdog. Instead, it was to find something solid. And the game that stood out to me most here was Newcastle versus Man United, and the bet I made was very simple. I put my money on over 2.5 total goals. In other words, the match needed 3 goals for the bet to win. Now, some of you might think betting on goals is a bit insane, because all it takes is 1 slow game, 1 defensive setup, 1 missed chance, and the entire bet falls apart. But here's why I disagree. See, when I started looking at the numbers behind these two teams, something interesting appeared to me. The games that Newcastle played have been full of goals all season long, and across the 2025 to 2026 Premier League campaign, their matches were averaging 2.93 goals per game. Not only that, but when they played at home, things became even more chaotic. At St James's Park, more than 70% of their games had over 2.5 goals. This is not the only thing that convinced me. The second biggest factor behind the bet was that Manchester United were really no different either. Their matches were averaging 3.14 goals per game, which meant that when these two teams played each other, there was a strong chance that the game would open up very quickly. But the stat that really caught my attention was the expected goals, or XG. Expected goals is a model, if you didn't know already, that basically estimates how many goals the team should have scored based on the quality of the chances they create. And for this match, the model predicted around 3.3 total goals, which predicted predicted Newcastle to score around 1.72 goals and Man United around 1.61. Now, you add them together and it sits comfortably above the 2.5 goal line. In simple terms, the numbers were pointed towards a game where both teams would likely find chances. So the bet went in with $1,000 on over 2.5 goals. And once the match kicked off, the only thing left to do was wait and see if the game would actually open up the way the numbers suggested. Remember, one bad result here and it would wipe out all the momentum from day one. In the 41st minute, Jacob Ramsey went down in the box looking for a call, but the referee saw it as a dive, so he did end up getting the second yellow, and suddenly Newcastle were down to 10 men. Usually, a red card kills the over 2.5 bet, because the short-handed team parks the bus, the opponent slows the tempo, and the game basically just dies. I had basically lost all hope at this point, but well, I didn't know that this wasn't a usual game. Deep into first half stoppage time, Anthony Gordon somehow earns Newcastle a penalty, and of course he didn't miss. Then again, just before half time, Bruno curled the ball into the box and Casemiro headed the ball in. So just like that, we went into half time with 2 goals on the board and a man in the locker room. All I needed was one more goal, but with Newcastle down a man for 45 minutes, the tension was actually suffocating me. The second half was a grind because even after 80 minutes, it was still 1-1. This bet was hanging by an absolute thread. We just needed 1 goal, otherwise we were going to be banking a $1,000 loss. But then came the 90th minute. The substitute Will Osula came on, scoring an absolute banger, and just like that, day 2 added another $600 in profit, pushing the total for the week up to $2,070. So we were 2 days in now, and every single bet so far had worked. But a perfect streak like that rarely lasts forever, and day 3 is about to prove why that is. The next match on the board was Tottenham versus Crystal Palace, and this one came with a slightly different approach. Instead of chasing a big return, the idea here was to take a safer position. So the bet idea was Tottenham draw no bet with $500 at 1.7x odds. Now, draw no bet, if you didn't know already, is exactly what it sounds like. If Tottenham won the match, the bet would pay out. But if the game ended in a draw, I would get my stake returned to me. So the only way the bet loses money here is if Tottenham actually lost. But what was my logic behind this exact pick? See, Crystal Palace have been struggling badly when they played away from home. Over their last 6 away games, they've only managed 1 win. And not just that, but most of their performances on the road have been very slow, defensive, and lacking, any sort of real confidence. And Tottenham, on the other hand, weren't exactly flying either. They've been going through a rough run of form themselves, which made this game a little uncomfortable to bet on. But sometimes struggling teams become dangerous when they reach a certain point in the season, because at that point they stop playing a certain style and start playing for their survival. That's pretty much it. And Tottenham are getting dangerously close to that situation. They were hovering near and around the relegation fight, so this match carried some real pressure. So dropping more points could drag them even further into the problem they're currently in. In situations like that, teams often find another level of urgency. Tottenham had also won 13 of their last 19 meetings against Crystal Palace, which suggested they usually handled this matchup well. So when you combine Palace's bad away form, Tottenham's need for points, and the safety of the draw no bet protection, this pick felt pretty reasonable. But then the match kicked off, and instead of Tottenham taking control, the game slowly started drifting in the wrong direction. Palace held their ground as the pressure built, and eventually the result landed in the one outcome the bet wasn't protected against. Tottenham lost. What a surprise. And just like that, the perfect start to the week was over. The bet dropped $500, and even though it wasn't a total disaster, it still stung. After 2 easy days, the challenge started to feel a lot more real. The bankroll was still healthy, sitting at $1,570 in profit, but the perfect streak was gone. And once a losing bet appears, it changes the way you look at every pick that comes next. On day 4, the next opportunity came from Wolves versus Liverpool. And this one had a strange backstory. So earlier in the week, these two teams had already played each other. And on paper, yeah, Wolves won that match, but the numbers told a completely different story. Liverpool had absolutely dominated the game. The expected goals were 0.44 for Wolves and 2.56 for Liverpool, which is an absolutely huge gap. Liverpool also had 20 shots, controlled most of the play, and created far more dangerous chances. In most matches with those sort of numbers, that team is going to win. But football doesn't always reward the better team. Sometimes a goalkeeper might have the best game of his life, the ball might just refuse to go in, and sometimes a team can just get genuinely unlucky. And that's exactly what made this rematch look very interesting. Across the last 22 meetings, Liverpool have beaten Wolves 17 times, and that kind of record can't be just luck. I was sure Liverpool would win, but instead of just betting on a simple Liverpool win, the pick here was slightly more aggressive. I bet on Liverpool -1 Asian handicap. That means that Liverpool would need to win by at least 2 goals for the bet to fully cash in. So if they only won by 1 goal though, I'd get my stake refunded. So it wasn't the safest option, but considering how dominant Liverpool were in the previous match, it felt like a reasonable risk. So the bet went in for $500 at 1.8x odds. So the whistle blew at Molineux, and for the first 45 minutes, it was 0-0. When you have $500 riding on a -1 handicap, a scoreless draw is a slow motion disaster. Not gonna lie, I was kind of panicking, thinking to myself, like, am I gonna get another L here? Did I put too much confidence in a team that's been, relatively shaky this season? But as I was doubting myself, in the 51st minute, Andy Robertson decided he had just seen enough. At that moment, the bet was safe because a 1-goal win meant a refund. My $500 would come back, but there'd be no profit. But now I didn't just want a refund, I wanted the win. And 2 minutes later, Liverpool finally scored the second goal. And by the time the final whistle blew, Liverpool had scored 3 and conceded 1, which meant the bankroll had swallowed another $400 in profit. And the total for the week was back up to $1,970. The comeback was complete and the challenge was back on track. But the next bet was about to carry a lot more pressure, because by day 5, the bankroll was big enough that one more win could turn the week into something serious, or it could doom the entire challenge. By the time the next day arrived, the challenge had already turned into something bigger than what I expected. One more good result could push the week past the $2,000 mark, which was far more than most bettors would ever expect in a few days. But this particular game wasn't an easy one. The matchup was Newcastle versus Man City, played at St James's Park, obviously one of the toughest stadiums in the country for visiting teams. And Newcastle were coming off a huge win earlier in the week. Remember, they just beaten Man United and they did it while playing most of the match with 10 men. But by the time the match ended, they looked absolutely battered. Keep in mind, Newcastle were already dealing with another issue. Their injuries had just started piling up, and one absence in particular was the biggest game changer. When Bruno Guimaraes isn't in the lineup, Newcastle often look like a completely different team. The midfield loses control, the passing slows down, and the entire structure of their attack just looks completely different. And at the same time, Man City have been producing much stronger numbers. Even when City didn't dominate the scoreboard, the underlying metrics usually showed them controlling the game. And if that wasn't enough, City had won 4 of the last 5 meetings between the teams, and 7 of the last 10 overall. And so even though playing away at Newcastle is never comfortable, it still leaned towards City. And the odds obviously reflected that risk. Instead of a short favourite, the price was 2.3x odds, which meant the payout would be much bigger if the bet landed. So the decision was simple, and it was to put $500 on Man City to win. And once the match kicked off, the tension was obvious. Newcastle fought hard early, feeding off the energy of the crowd, but over time, the difference in quality started to show and I could put myself to ease. City had the possession, created the most chances, and slowly took control of the match. By the final whistle, day 5 ended in $650 in profit, pushing the weekly total all the way up to $2,620 of profit. 5 days into the challenge, and the bankroll had grown far beyond where I had expected, which meant the final day suddenly carried a lot more weight than I thought, because now there was one last bet standing between this week and the final result. At this point, the goal was to simply close the week with one more solid pick. The final game on the board was Fulham versus Southampton, and the matchup looked promising on paper. Fulham had dominated the recent meetings between the two clubs, winning the last 4 head-to-head games. On top of that, there was also a clear difference in the level of competition both teams were used to. Fulham were playing in the Premier League, and Southampton obviously in the Championship, and the gap between these two leagues can be very significant. Teams coming up from the Championship often struggle when playing against Premier League quality, so the bet was slightly aggressive but still reasonable. I bet $250 at 1.86 odds with -1 Asian handicap for Fulham. And as you already know, that means Fulham need to win by 2 goals for this bet to cash, and if they win by 1 goal, the stake gets refunded. It wasn't the biggest bet of the week, but it was one that would close the story perfectly. But this time, the result didn't cooperate. Southampton absolutely cooked Fulham. Fulham couldn't create the margin needed for the handicap, and the bet fell short. And unfortunately, the final day ended with a $250 loss. But even with that result, the week ended far ahead of where it started. The challenge closed with a total profit of $2,370. Now, going into this challenge, I admit the goal wasn't to prove that sports betting was easy. It was simply to see what would happen if research played out over a short stretch of games. And somehow over the course of 6 days, the numbers added up to $2,370 of profit. Honestly, that still feels a little strange to say out loud, because anyone who watches football long enough knows how unpredictable the sport can be. But this week just happened to be one of them where most of the decisions decided to be on the right side. So I don't know, do you think I got lucky this time, or shall I try again, see if I can do it for 2 weeks? Let me know in the comments down below.